Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harry Froklage, and I'm the Director of Development and Graduate Affairs here at St. Jerome's. I always begin these lectures every year by feeling that I have to apologize for not being David Seljak. You have no idea how much consternation this causes me. Those of you who are regular attendees at the St. Jerome Centre lectures will understand immediately that I'm referring to the director of the Centre, who invariably welcomes you to the wonderful series of lectures on offer. David possesses a kind of puckish irreverence that I can never quite match. Still, this evening promises to be just as wonderful. It differs in that this is the night that we honor one of our own, a graduate of St. Jerome's University, who has distinguished him or herself in the lives that they have lived since leaving their alma mater. The Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate Award was established 2 decades ago for the express purpose of conferring such recognition upon our graduates. Tonight, we add another worthy name to an impressive list of individuals who tested their wings, their ideas, their independence in these halls, and went on to enact the values and capabilities that they discovered in the rest of their lives and all over the world. It is an evening on which only the very best of welcomes will do, which is why I've asked our President, Michael W. Higgins, to extend his greetings to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Higgins.
There are moments when I'm glad that Harry is not David Seljak. Indeed, welcome everyone here to the Norman Choate Distinguished Graduate Award lecture, and indeed to see tonight's honoree. And it's a great pleasure to, as president of this institution, have the opportunity, it's one of the really genuine pleasures of the job, to travel around and to see our graduates, to meet them, to eat with them, to hear their tales of success and sometimes difficulty, it's life after all, to see what has happened to them. And more importantly, to know something about the formative influence that various individuals have played in their lives here in their alma mater. Tonight is no exception. Tonight, indeed, is the 19th presentation of the Father Norm Choate Distinguished Graduate Award, which is given annually, as you know, to a graduate of St. Jerome's who has distinguished her or himself in both professional and community terms. The very real, palpable success of our graduates as citizens and as people is an important and sometimes neglected aspect of St. Jerome's life as a community. Our graduates support us by advocating on our behalf in the corridors of power, in industry, in academia, and in health, by affirming the importance of a Roman Catholic liberal arts education, by sending their children to register with us. We like that part. By establishing bursaries and scholarships to assist current students, and by excelling in their personal and in their professional lives. This year's distinguished graduate, Eva Kmiecic, is a worthy addition to the list of past graduates who have been honored in this way. And if you have time, on another occasion perhaps, you can go upstairs and you can see the gallery, the portraits that we have of them hanging on the wall. It's an important part of tonight's festivities to make sure that the honoree is introduced by a person who knows him or her, clearly herself, well. Such a person tonight is a member of the faculty for a long time here. Much respected. In fact, one of the people that when Harry and I go out traveling, one of the people who comes up all the time as somebody who had a powerful and shaping influence on their lives as they grew up, in residence, in courses in history, is Father James Wall. Jim is an associate professor in the Department of History here at St. Jerome's University, a lecturer of many years standing, very importantly, an author in his own right, having contributed various works on the Congregation of the Resurrection, indeed as a co-author of the official history of St. Jerome's University, and very importantly, the history of the Church in Bermuda. For our purposes tonight, it's important to know that he taught Eva, and very important to know as well that he has remained a friend of Eva's over the years. In fact, Eva's husband, Paul, was commenting earlier this evening at dinner that he was practically part of their courtship. He said, every now, who's this Jim Wall coming up all the time? The conversations, around the dinner table and elsewhere. So finally he had a chance to meet Jim Wall. And indeed, it's my pleasure now to invite Jim to come up and to indeed introduce Eva Kmiecic. Jim?
I didn't know I was part of the courtship. We'll discuss that later. Yes. I am really honored to be asked to introduce Eva. We have been friends for a long time, but I have to confess, I had to ask her tonight at dinner, why did you ask for me? And she said, well, because you kind of represent St. Jerome, what it was all about. And you've been part of the history, my history of St. Jerome since the very beginning. And I said, that's true, but I only taught you one course. And I can't remember her in that course at all. Which means she was either very good or very poor or never came to class. But that's not true. We finally figured out why it is that I became, for whatever reason, an important part of her life. Eva came to St. Jerome's she lived in Blucher Street at that time. Blucher Street at that time was the other side of the tracks of the North Ward. The North Ward was the other side of the tracks, but everywhere else. She came as an off-campus student, and so she had to find a place really to kind of settle in, you might say. And she found the place. And that was the place where we kind of really interacted. Eva is one of the graduates of perhaps the most important class that I and other profs taught at St. Jerome's. He didn't have a name, except someone called it recently, we call it World Affairs 105. It was held in the coffee shop. Now, in the coffee shop where Mrs. Brown sold her coffee, Eva showed at that time her ability to distinguish between what was really good and what wasn't. She never drank the coffee. Nor did I. And it was around that table, those tables, that perhaps Eva and I really made contact. I don't know what we talked about. Although I think one time I tried to explain to her that God was really male, because if God were female, the world would be upside down. That did not go down too well. But something else, I think, became apparent to me as I think about it. One of the things that Eva did that was unique was she didn't dress like everyone else. Eva dressed like a real person. Eva always came dressed in a dress or a nice... She didn't wear the old jeans and sweatshirt or whatever it might be that students then and now wear. I don't think... Did you ever have a pair of jeans? No, I didn't think so. You never had a pair of jeans in your life, nor did I. So I think we were kind of kindred spirits. I like to think that it was around that table, in that course, which she liked so much. And she liked it because, of course, it was a very special kind of course. There were no requirements, no tests, no essays. Didn't have to show up. That was her kind of course. It was the kind of course she worked all through grade 13, as she told us. In grade 13, she had only one course and spent the rest of her time running around doing all kinds of other things, as she always has. But everything she did running around was very important. Everything she did was for the community. And I think that one of the things, perhaps, that she may have learned, I hope, in that World Affairs 105, or what we wanted to call it, was that the important thing in life was not the company, was not the institution, but it was the people that the institution, the company, was to serve. I hope that's one of the things that St. Jerome's taught her, that we, all of us who were involved in St. Jerome's, teachers, administration, staff, the important thing was the student, not the institution. And if she learned that from that class of 105, whatever you want to call it, and not to drink the coffee, then I think St. Jerome can be proud of her. And we are. And we are proud of all of our graduates. Eva came at a time when we were talking about that in 1972. Things were changing. The old students of the 60s and the early 70s, the radicals, they were a thing of the past. And she came with a new vision, as did the rest of her class. And she carried that vision with her. Harry gave me a bunch of biographical notes. which I was supposed to not read, I guess. But one of the things that was important was that she carried with her her conviction about service wherever she went, and that she did. And so I am very happy and honored to be able to introduce to you Eva Kmiecic, recipient of the Norman Choate Graduate Award. Eva.
I'd like to thank Patty Tush, who is a representative of the Graduates Association and here tonight to represent that group. It only remains for us to hear now from the award's namesake, Father Norm Choate. Father Choate was the former president of St. Jerome's, and he was here from 1979 to 1989. He's now retired and lives in Florida, but he was here at St. Jerome's during Eva's tenure as a student and sent along the following message of congratulations. Please accept my most sincere congratulations on receiving this award. I am very proud and grateful that the alumni who designate the recipients of this award have maintained its integrity by presenting it to persons who have dedicated themselves to the enhancement of the common good. You certainly fit that criterion. In a time of rampant individualism, it is essential that there be persons whose career is that of public service, committed to the commonweal, and a special concern for the most vulnerable among us. I remember well your intelligence, charm, and energy, and I am very proud that St. Jerome's has played a part in your quest for the greater good. I pray that you will continue to offer your many talents for the benefit of all, and that you will continue your work for many, many years to come. Sincerely, Father Norm. It's important to note that Eva demonstrated intelligence, charm, and energy without the benefit of coffee. Each year, we like to align the designated graduate or the distinguished graduate presentation with the Graduates Association lecture. We usually ask the recipient to identify a professor here at St. Jerome's who has been influential during his or her time and invite that person to speak on a subject of their interest in choosing. This year, however, we have departed from this because the recipient is herself a wonderful, seasoned speaker. As I looked at Eva's qualifications, I was struck by the clear connection between her personal sense of values and the career trajectory that she had chosen for herself. I spoke to her and asked if she would be interested in talking about how she had enacted those values in her life and how, in her position with United Way of Canada, Centraide Canada, with which she is the Senior Vice President in charge of strategic planning, she sees the need for individuals with strongly held values to come together and create a greater good. She said she'd love to. Ladies and gentlemen, Eva Kmiecic.
So now I'm really nervous. And I really just want to start by saying that I feel very undeserving of this recognition and this award, but thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here on a Friday evening on Remembrance Day, most of all. I'm truly honored by being able to be back here at St. Jerome's with you this evening. I've been fortunate to have had many new and varied experiences over a lot of years, but it feels really good to be back here, back home, among familiar friends, family, which is in the front row here, and spaces once again. And I do thank you from my heart for this award, and I'll try not to cry. The principles that Harry and Father Wall talked about that have guided me through my whole life, I've learned in two places. One was here. The years that I spent on this campus, actually studying ancient history and philosophy, reading the Greeks and the Romans, initiating the debate on what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be truly good, what it means to be a leader, and then carrying on those discussions with professors and fellow students, yes, at the coffee shop. Those years have had a lasting impact on me and on my thinking. What my professors knew then, but I did not, was the long-lasting value of the critical ideas that were planted and germinating within me at that time, and the survival skills that would be required to put principles into practice, the precious analytic tools and values that would be needed to make difficult yet ethical decisions down the road. And I haven't always done those. I've also wavered. I've been human, but I've learned. But even before that, I've learned from some very important principles from my parents, Rose and Stan Kmiecic. My father's unable to be here this evening, but my mother is here, and I'd like to dedicate this award to them. Dla ciebie, mama. Dziękuję bardzo. Roy Romano, speaking last week about his own life as a child of an immigrant, said, "We are the children of exceptional circumstances, and history has shaped us in particular ways." My story, which I've been asked to share with you, Mom, if you cry, I'm going to cry, this evening begins with them, and in so many ways, their story is so much more remarkable than mine. Save for her sister, my mother's entire family died during the war. She spent years in a forced labor camp, growing vegetables for the soldiers, and more years in a refugee camp after the war. A Canadian textile mill owner in the eastern townships of Quebec was looking for laborers, and he brought over about 100 young women, including my mother and her sister, to Canada in 1947. They were known, if you can believe it, as the Flying Virgins, and that's a whole nother story. At the beginning of the war, my father was a Polish teenager, 19 years old, studying to be an engineer. When I was 19, I was here, sitting in that amazing, I could almost say infamous St. Jerome's coffee shop. How many here knew the coffee shop? Okay, a few of you. Good. Remember that coffee? No, never mind. Debating the finer points of Plato's arguments on democracy with my dearest pals, Chris Bauer and Father Wall. At that same age, my father lacked the luxury of debate. By the summer of his 19th year, he was fighting with the partisans in the underground in Poland, then being shot and captured by enemy troops, figuring out how to survive in a concentration camp just down the road from Auschwitz. After the war, the Canadian Pacific Railway was looking for workers, and my father came to Canada to work on the railroad. My parents lacked a formal education, but what an education they provided me. They taught me that it is important to make a real difference in your community, that one person's courageous actions can change so much for so many. They taught me that I have an obligation to help to build my country and to protect its freedoms, and in so doing to act ethically for the greater good. They taught me to value truth on a personal level, and they taught me to watch for truthfulness in government, in business, in every sector that I worked in. And they led by example. And I would like to thank them both for working all those extra shifts over so many years to make sure that I had the opportunity to get a formal education here at St. Jerome's. So much changes from one generation to the next. And even though today, November 11th, is when we remember the end of the First World War, it's also a day that we remember and honor the achievements of those who have suffered or fought in any war, in order that we who stand here today may have the luxury of our pursuits. It's also a day when we look inside ourselves to do a little inventory. What do we cherish? What or whom could we fight for? What or whom should we resist? Lord Chesterfield said, "We are in truth more than half of what we are in imitation." The great point is to choose good models and to study them with care. My parents and my educators, including my grade school educators, of which some are here, were my models and kindled in me a passion for social justice. I've also learned from the experience and partner of my husband, Paul Migas, who, like me, has served for many years in government, trying to do the public good. Together, they have helped me understand that we do not always have the luxury of time, that the society we live in is of our making, and that it's a project always in progress, that the pursuit of truth and justice matters, that we will only have the opportunity to pursue our individual dreams if we ensure our collective freedom and capacity to do so, and that how we act in pursuing this will affect the results. And that has directed my career path and the speed I decided to travel it, and the manner in which I traveled it, a career spanning public service, public policy, and public good. When Harry Frockledge asked me to speak this evening, beyond saying a few warm words of thanks and gratitude, I decided that with your indulgence, I'd like to speak for a short while about what I've learned since I left St. Jerome's, about striving for the greater good, and the values and principles that underpin that. Let me state at the outset that my intent is to raise an alarm by engaging in a little truth-telling. As a public servant for over 20 years, one's always the invisible, behind-the-scenes contributor to public policy and service delivery. Having a podium to speak from, other than being very nervous, in a more public way is actually unusual and somewhat discomforting, especially when it's about an increasing anxiety in me in watching public life deteriorate. and to begin to fundamentally affect the integrity of our policies and services, and more alarmingly, the sustainability of critical public values and public discourse. I've been privileged to sit at executive tables, to participate in policy debates at a very senior level on public security, on citizenship and immigration, on refugees, on health care, policing, and now through the work with the United Way Centraide movement, on building partnerships among organizations, governments, labor, volunteers, to improve our neighbors, our neighborhoods and communities, to deal with root causes of social dislocation and distress. And this is my message tonight. In the past 30 years, since I sat in that St. Jerome's coffee shop, I have regrettably witnessed a steady erosion of integrity, of honor, and responsibility at the highest levels of government, the corporate sector, the public service, and in other environments as well. I'd like to quantify that or qualify that, and others can do that, but that's not the purpose of my speech tonight. I'm also painfully aware that there's an old Yugoslavian proverb that says, "Tell the truth and run." Well, in fact, when I left the R.C.M.P., my staff gave me this wonderful plaque that I keep with me at my office that says, "Speak truth to power and leave immediately thereafter." So I will. I'll tell the truth, and then I'll run. I'm convinced that we are experiencing a very destructive cycle of a new set of values that are creeping within our society in both our public and private life. Values that translate themselves into practices such as deception, personal ambition, and cynicism. Contrasting these with values we've held dearly, we've built our nation upon, and we write into every code of ethics and values that I've ever seen, values like honesty, integrity, openness, and respect. And I believe that if we do not individually, one step at a time, stand together to regain our moral center, the society we hand to the next generation will be unrecognizable and unlivable. Roy Romano just more eloquently said this very thing in a speech he made to the Council of Canadians. And I quote, "Sometimes I feel that Canada is at the most critical of crossroads. There are moments when I feel we are well down a pathway that leads to more poverty, increased racism, increasing crime, increasing environmental degradation. I don't recognize this road as a Canadian one." Unquote. I agree. I am by nature an optimistic, glass-half-full kind of person. I laugh a lot. My nickname used to be Little Susie Sunshine, and don't anyone ever use that outside of this room. Romano's challenge to have us recommit to the miracle of Canada resonates with me. But I've also, since my days here, continued to be an avid student of history. You'll be pleased to know, Father Wall, I actually did learn something from your course. We analyze and synthesize all sorts of trends through both formal and informal methods. And in my years as a senior public servant, as Deputy Commissioner of the R.C.M.P., I had the opportunity to crystallize this way of seeing by preparing what we called comprehensive environmental scans, a methodology that I've carried over into my work with the United Way Centraide movement. The purpose of such a scan is to locate patterns that recur time and again, to discover what might be their natural rhythms, to draw experiences that can inform us about the present and the future. And my observation is that we are moving rapidly into new work, new life, new societies and environments, having had no chance to consider the principles that should underpin these, nor the outcomes or the alternatives. We're moving at glib speed. We're not just experimenting, but we're wholesale importing new work methods, technologies, and styles. We're fracturing communications channels. We're balkanizing decision-making processes without taking adequate time to ensure fundamental principles of humanity, of integrity, and empathy are in place. So that we can keep up with the speed and pace of change, we're giving too short shrift to first understanding the values we're trying to achieve and how we'll achieve our goals with ethical, principled behavior. I'm also afraid we're losing the concept of the commons, of civil society, of shared values, of common purpose and understandings, of a place where we can have a safe and honest conversation about changes we are participating in, about the decisions we take. There are a lot of people attempting to focus on this latter noble purpose, and there are lots of excellent examples of real success stories. My husband is one of those examples. Paul Megas currently has been actively building a new department called Service Canada, an attempt to try to bring those values by first focusing on Canadians and their needs. To quote a great trend analyzer, Peter Drucker, we're in the midst of a real transformation that only occurs about once every 100 years. And it's sometimes hard to see what's really happening to us and what the results will look like and mean for our children and grandchildren. What I do know is that there are components to our fundamental shift that have very questionable aspects to them, and they need to be aired. Mostly, I guess, I'm galled by leaders who are at the apex of this shift in a variety of sectors who have learned to lie too easily, whether because the lie is more palatable than the truth or because it helps them achieve some end, noble or ignoble. Machiavelli's "the end justifies the means" concept, which in its time spoke to similar fracturing of civil society and similar leadership behavior of deception and self-aggrandizement. Walking around Ottawa today could be reminiscent of that time, but it also reminds me of the opening of George Orwell's book, 1984, The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, not so much truth. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. The Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs and less than plenty. Their names in Orwell's newspeak, Mini True, Mini Pax, Mini Love, Mini Plenty. It's entirely surreal, and it feels like Ottawa these days. I've been struggling with what I've been witnessing, as have many others far more sophisticated than me in this type of historical analysis, about what's happened to so many of our leaders, politicians, public servants, corporate leaders, thought leaders in our country. We used to have honest differences around key policies, social, economic theories, monetary policy. You could shake hands, have real debate, count on the other person's integrity, walk out being friends. Now if you think that way, you're dismissed as naive or vulnerable. We've come to the sorry point where we expect one another to lie. We can't trust the process, and we need to watch our backsides because no one will really stand up and help us. So many don't speak truth anymore for fear of reprisals, or simply for a lack of belief that anything will change, that our voice matters. Therefore, it's no wonder that trends have been clearly pointing to issues of a dramatic decline in trust and confidence in our public leaders and the public institutions that form the backbone of this society, our parliamentary system, our public services that built the physical infrastructure of our nation. And the data around corporate leaders is even far more damaging. Enron, WorldCom, delay, you know the litany. Recent studies by the Conference Board of Canada assure us that the public trust has declined legitimately because our current approaches to governance, public and corporate, are not preventing what they call ethical lapses. The trouble is that it's not just a bad apple or two in the bushel. It seems to be a pervasive new culture unfolding. This culture has evolved also on a global level. Stephen Lewis's Massey lectures this year on what has happened in Africa as a result of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's economic policies that just fundamentally eroded social infrastructure in countries in Africa that were vibrant. They know this, they won't admit it, and they don't redress it. Read Romeo Dallaire's account of what actually happened in Rwanda. Leadership, ethical, principled leadership makes a profound difference, the difference between life and death. This decline of trust and confidence is here in Canada. The most recent example is what is extraordinarily documented by Justice Gomery, who has described what he calls, and I quote, the dreadful subversion and betrayal of the public trust by public officials, unquote. One indicator at a public level of the decline of trust given unethical behavior by our leaders is in the voter turnout at the polls. Many of our youth, for example, just don't care about voting and the parliamentary system. Just this week, I was asked to identify a number of people in our Ottawa community, ordinary citizens, who would be interested in coming to a meeting being held tomorrow on democratic reform, in plain speak about looking at why the current voting process and the elections are in decline and why huge segments of our population are disillusioned with them. I spoke with some young people to invite them to this meeting, and they were singularly uninterested, clearly stating that the current system, quote, is irrelevant to them and, quote, mostly corrupted by a lot of old guys positioning for personal gain, so what's the point, unquote. These young people not only are not connected to this discussion, but they don't want to be. Their blogs are more important, as are their immediate peer groups. My reflection is, what happens when these young people are our age? What will be their democratic values, their democratic process and electoral system then, if today they do not even feel that they can spend time helping to reshape it? The Decline of Deference, Neil Nevitt's very thoughtful book, is more than a frightening reality. It's a call to arms. And this decline is not just about politicians or corporate leaders, it's spilling over to a number of professions, accountants, lawyers. Most recently, a friend of mine made me say this, we've watched medical professionals make hay of any rational discussion on how to provide timely access to good health care in this country without making significant demonstrable progress towards regaining the public trust. Promises are made, promises are broken. And I'm sure people in this room can come up with their own examples, professional and personal. We've become inured to deception in public life. Public debate, and often the media's coverage of it, has become a scorekeeper's game. Rounds of applause for beating your opponent, be they right or wrong, with a few minutes in the penalty box if you get caught making a foul play. Parliament's question period fuels this perception for anyone who even cares to watch this anymore. Unfortunately, this isn't a game. This is playing for keeps. Decisions made today have consequences long past the next election. I'm not alone in this observation, of course. Perhaps, like me, you're now feeling inundated and a bit queasy, listening to the doomsayer. Jane Jacobs didn't pull any punches with the title of her book, Dark Age Ahead, which talks about the decline of our cities. Nor did Jared Diamond with his most recent book, Collapse, the destruction of our societies. Ronald Wright made many of the same points in last year's Massey lecture, A Short History of Progress, and he writes, the future of everything we have accomplished since our intelligence evolved will depend on the wisdom of our actions over the next few years. We have a present so colossal that error is a luxury we can no longer afford. The world has grown too small to forgive us any mistake, unquote. So what does history teach us about periods of time when public discourse has become corrupt? Hi, Mary. When the very leaders who shape our society are unprincipled. Barbara Tuchman wrote a very insightful book called The March of Folly, From Troy to Vietnam. I'm sure had she lived, she might have added a few more chapters to From Troy to Vietnam. But in her book, she outlines the pattern of leaders acting against their own acting with their own self-interest, emerging in acts of folly and public deception. The list is long. The Renaissance popes provoking the Protestant succession through their corruption. Please don't strike me down. Philip II of Spain sending the Spanish Armada into disaster, the American involvement in Vietnam. But in her introduction, she observes that for 2,500 years, at least the last 2,500 years, the big political philosophers with whom we are familiar, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, all devoted their energy to issues of ethics, the rights of man, the social contract, balancing freedom and order. Are we in such another era? I worry we are. Last year I came across a very obscure book written in 1997 titled The Fourth Turning. Books written by a fascinating and unusual set of authors. William Strauss, the co-founder and director of Capital Steps, which is a Washington-based political cabaret in the tradition of our Royal Canadian Air Force. And Neil Howe, a historian economist with a number of leading U.S. academic institutions. The book begins with the line, quote, America feels like it's unraveling. Wherever we are heading, they wrote, America is evolving in ways most of us don't like or understand. Individually focused yet collectively adrift, we wonder if we're heading toward a waterfall, unquote. In some detail, they look at the cycles that appear and reappear throughout history as they describe them. First a high cycle, then an awakening, then an unraveling, then a crisis, then another high, each about 20 years in length, totaling about 107 years. Applying this concept of cycles to our recent history, they describe the crisis period that led us up into the events of the Second World War and what actually contributed to this crisis. Then there was a high period that followed as survivors created a new life, as America became a superpower, as the middle class grew, as many of our Canadian social policies and programs were actually put into place. Somewhere, though, in the mid-60s and early 70s, and Father Wall alluded that tonight, as many of us recall, there was an awakening period. Urban riots, counterculture, feminism, black power, environmentalism, an awakening time that brought powerful new ideas, new leaders, new developments, new experiments. Then came the unraveling in the mid-1980s, individualism, personal confidence, acquisitive ambition against a backdrop of growing violence and incivility, distrust of leaders and institutions. In our recent memory, we've watched any sense of a national consensus split apart. Instead, we have competing value camps. We are experiencing the sound and fury of a growing number of spin doctors trying to calm our fears about a number of these warning signs, but at the most individual level, we know things are shifting. Concepts of outsourcing, privatization, new experiments in way institutions are modeled are not good or bad, wrong or right. But we're holistically importing these and their underpinning values into systems that weren't designed for them and have not yet been redesigned. We're not meaningfully engaging in reshaping the institutions and policies that will take us into the next half century and beyond. Instead, we are caught up in a continuous expose of unethical behavior, and we continue to disconnect. Throughout this, we are witnessing a decline in empathy for our fellow Canadians. The Me First generation has evolved into the Why You generation, a time of unraveling. A high, followed by an awakening, then an unraveling, and now a crisis. In Strauss and Howe's view of the world, somewhere around 2005 marks the beginning of the fourth turning, the crisis phase, much like the one that preceded the Second World War. Recently interviewed, Strauss and Howe pondered whether or not that crisis period actually began with the events of 9/11, a very American viewpoint, but as good a time as any to think that maybe we have entered this era. So what again happens during this crisis period from history's lessons? By World War I, apparently, crisis had come to mean a sudden acceleration of the historical process in a terrifying manner sufficient to release economic, social, and moral forces of unforeseen power and dimensions which often make return to the status quo impossible. It denotes the maximum moment of strife or the optimal moment for good. By the way, Strauss and Howe also talk about the Etruscan concept of the saeculum, that civilizations live for about 1,000 years, about 10 cycles of these turnings. I won't debate the formula they used to determine this, but suffice to say, they matched it to the endurance of ancient Chinese civilization, the Etruscan era, and Roman civilization. According to Strauss and Howe, while the U.S. civilization or Western society may only be in its midterm cycle, there are serious warning signs of its decline as a civilization, and they squarely underline leadership and ethics as key contributors to this. As we move into this latest crisis turning, they suggest, there are ways to turn this period into an optimal period, a period of good, not strife. And the very first step for preparing for this, they note, is to prepare values. Quote, the open question is which values will reign and whether America's cultural consensus will be broad and imaginative enough to avoid a destructive polarization as the nation fights for its survival. Americans of all generations should work to elevate moral and cultural standards. What we do now may not close down many of the unraveling era carnivals, but will serve two critical longer-term purposes: to help protect the world of childhood and to help resacralize public institutions and reinfuse them with a much-needed sense of public purpose. You know and I know that ethical decisions and actions don't come about because of good rules or laws. Ethical actions come about because of strongly held personal values. For the public service, these were well documented. In response to voiced concerns that the public service values are shifting, if not eroding, values like fairness, integrity, service to Canadians, John Tate, a former deputy minister, wrote a groundbreaking document called A Strong Foundation. John Tate wrote about the perceived breach in the social contract between the federal government and its employees as it went through the downsizing of the 1990s when 50,000 public servants lost their job, one that they had perceived, rightly or wrongly, as lasting and secure. That breach may have contributed to a new contract that has emerged, one that has seen entitlement creep into the lexicon of public service values. And entitlement has been at the core of recent unethical and, in some quarters, criminal behavior on the part of public servants, which have become public fodder for the Auditor General, the Gomery Commission, and the courts. It all makes us a little bit cynical. Quote, serious discussion of values must inevitably address the gap between aspiration and reality. The easy answer when confronted with this gap is to say we've set our aspirations too high, to turn away from our values. The tougher approach is to ask how we can continue to close this gap, to walk the talk, to renew our values. It's our values that pull us forward, that command us to improve. A richer, fuller understanding of our values can only help us to build on the finest traditions and aspirations of the public service. End of quote. Despite my concerns in this gloomy speech, Two things keep my sense of optimism buoyant, if indeed we are now into the crisis period in our turn of history. One is, I think, in my genetic makeup. Things can get very, very bad indeed, but individual people working together can make daily choices to act ethically, decently, humanely, perhaps even blindly optimistically, regardless of the outcomes. For it is in these small and individual acts that we experience our humanity. It is what my parents and countless others like them did during and after the war that gave us on a personal level the homes and the lives, the neighborhoods, and the values that have formed us. And a societal level, the structures, the policies, and the institutions that today enable us to live enriched lives. They cared about their families and neighbors. They cared about their country. And in all honesty, the second factor that lets me sleep at night is my recent experience with organizations like United Way, Centraide, and the nonprofit sector, where values are really the starting point for so much of what we do. I've learned some amazing lessons that could certainly translate into other sectors. And public sector institutions I know, like this one, St. Jerome's, are making investments in courses and in opportunities for meaningful discourse on issues relating to ethics and leaderships, to values. And there are others. So let me share with you one final encouraging story I learned about Bhutan. As some of you may know, Bhutan is a small country of less than 2 million people, sandwiched between two of the most populous, energetic economies in the world, India and China. And despite their neighbors, they are apparently unafraid to chart their own course. The royal government of Bhutan decided some time ago to abandon the concept of the GDP, the gross domestic product, in favor of the GNH, the gross national happiness index. To achieve happiness, their new national agenda calls on people to adopt the Buddhist practice of Jimba. I have discovered that there are 3 types of Jimba actions. The first is the commitment of time and money to those who are needy, kind of our traditional notion of charity. The second is the act of offering kindness, wisdom, refuge, love to people, our traditional notion of neighborliness, our commitment to human values, our everyday actions in everyday ways. And the third is the promotion of the right path to one's fellow citizen, a societal commitment to a higher moral and ethical ground. Although for Buddhists, as in Bhutan, Jimba is a religious act, it also has the secular meaning of service to the public, of putting aside self-interest for the greater good, for the public interest. The government of Bhutan is hoping to foster a society, they say, where both the givers and the receivers of these acts of public service will experience greater happiness. Acts of Jimba, they predict, will help to build the 4 most important interdependent pillars of their society. What would they be, you would wonder? Economic self-reliance, environmental preservation, cultural promotion, good governance. And collectively, they are investing in making this happen by measuring their progress to happiness against their vision. Every person in Bhutan is involved. 2 million people are trying to be every day happy. Wow. When I read this, I'll admit I was blown away, and then my imagination simply ran away with me. I imagined turning on CBC's The National to hear Peter Mansbridge declaring that last quarter's gross national happiness index had gone up. That rather than stories about Gomery and breaches of public trust, stories about Gomer Pyle and investments in neighborliness were on the upswing. I imagined opening the pages of the business section of the Globe and Mail and reading daily statistics on acts of Jimba committed across the country, shares in national happiness measured by good deeds being done and counted, by the level of trust in public institutions that were hitting the roof, by young people clamoring to work in our public services and redesigning democratic systems to ensure their children and grandchildren had a legacy that they could be proud of. St. Jerome's had built a course on Jimba in the Catholic tradition. And for a moment, with John Lennon's help, I even imagined all the people living life in peace. What dreamers, what visionaries. What gets measured gets done. Think for a moment of the potential, the extraordinary transformative power of dedicated people measuring their progress towards achieving a vision on happiness on a national or international scale. Where serious people focus their attention and energy on economic, environmental, cultural, and social growth that promotes strong communities. real attention, working together, respecting differences of opinion, honestly listening to each other to find the best possible solutions, giving honest, forthright, authentic leadership, ensuring values of honesty, integrity, and respect that are at the forefront. The vision's not only contagious, it might turn out to be a product for export. Okay, Susie Sunshine, you say? As it happens, 16 of the good people of Bhutan came to Nova Scotia last year for a global conference on gross national happiness, only in Nova Scotia. It featured an extraordinary assembly of global thinkers from all around the world. It was opened by our then Governor General, Anne Modis Strong, and closed by a Kaylee with Raffi. We live in extraordinary times. And now the Atkinson Foundation has unveiled the Canadian Index on Well-Being, a dynamic new tool to help us measure our nation's social progress, not the GDP. Part of these measures are about the ethical underpinnings of our institutions and society, individual and collective behavior. My organization, United Way Centraide, and the Atkinson Foundation are actually working together to promote the idea of a Canadian Index of Well-Being, and we're actually part of an international trend to focus on what can truly improve lives and build sustainable communities. There are lots of others doing similar work. Mary Gordon talks about changing the world one child at a time through her Roots of Empathy program, the basic premise of which is helping children and teachers create more caring classrooms. So when children understand how others feel, they're less likely to hurt each other through bullying, exclusion, and violence, and to be less likely to be adults in that way. Enthusiasm for revitalizing society is spreading in part because the alternative is an unpalatable legacy for our children and grandchildren. Enthusiasm for the truth, as the illustrated history of St. Jerome's is titled. Coincidence? I think not. Orwell wrote, quote, "Political language today is designed to make lies sound truthful, murder respectful, and to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind." In spite of our campaigns for accountability or our new institutionalizing of whistleblowing, it's difficult to legislate integrity. It's entirely possible that our institutions are losing the moral authority to lead and are becoming increasingly irrelevant. As long as their concerns are petty and ambitious and full of spin in and outside of Ottawa, the machinations of government won't seem to matter that much to many of us. But we will benefit from good government, good business, good society if we reinvest in leadership premised on human values, on trustworthiness, on integrity, on being honest and authentic, on being humble and continuously learning, on having vision and direction for the greater good, and bringing others with you towards it. This is Stephen Covey's 8th habit, using both personal moral authority that moral values support and formal organizational authority to create systems that will help us achieve this goal. In 2002, I attended a St. Jerome's course on ethical leadership, and it was really instrumental in helping me take stock of what matters and in making the decision to move to the nonprofit sector. And when I did, I felt like I had come home, like I had finally found the place for me where I can truly make a difference. If I had paid more attention as a child, I would have learned that even the Lilliputians knew this. In closing then, let me quote Gulliver's observations. "The Lilliputians have more regard for good morals than for great abilities. Since government is necessary to mankind, they believe that Providence never intended to make management of public affairs a mystery to be comprehended only by the few persons of sublime genius, of which there are seldom 3 born in an age. They suppose truth, justice, temperance, and the like to be in every man's power, or woman's. The practice of which virtues, assisted by experience and a good attention, would qualify any person for service of his or her country, except where a course of study is specifically required. It's been said we get the leaders we deserve. What will prevail at the ballot box in the next election? What are the virtues within the grasp of every person? What will prevail among our public institutions? What will our society's values look like for our children and our grandchildren? What do our values look like? I hope that every person here will give some consideration to how they can make a difference, to build a culture where, once again, honesty and integrity are virtues, not just an indiscernible or laughable liability, that open, honest discussion and behavior prevails. Orwell said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." May we all be revolutionaries. Thank you.
It's always a truism when you work here at St. Jerome's that you say that we are judged and measured by the quality of our graduates. And it's always nice to see that that's affirmed in practical and concrete terms. Thank you, Eva. Eva's agreed to take some questions. I'm not sure what her observations and thoughts have provoked in your mind, but if you have some questions, if you could raise your hands, and Sarah assures me, and we'll see if we can answer some of those. Is there anyone here? Just one of the things that strikes me is that you did a great job of illustrating the kind of culture of deception that's become very persuasive and acceptable. And I'm just wondering how much that is the result of the intense, increased, ongoing scrutiny that public figures are continually subjected to, the spin that everything that they say is given to, so that they really they can't be authentic because the media and this whole process of scrutinizing them requires them to be manufactured in some way.
That's a great question, Harry. Thank you. And I think that's a valid perception. I think we live in a much more immediate environment where everything we do becomes very publicly accessible and visible. But if you read history, Barbara Tuchman, there's lots of examples of that very same sense of the decline of trust and confidence in our leaders and our institutions happening in eras when there was no media, when there was none of that public scrutiny, and when communication channels weren't quite that instant. So my sense is that is something that I think we need to take cognizance of, but I don't know that that is something we can hide behind. So I don't actually fundamentally believe it's because of that this is happening. I truly do feel that there are, and I'll speak on a very personal level, little acts every day make a difference. And it's very easy, we're all human, in those little acts to start sliding down a slippery slope. And at some point, you have to take stock of where you want to be, whether you want to be cascading down that slippery slope or you can stop, take stock, and act ethically. And I think it's easier to learn when you fail and you have some of those experiences to draw upon. It's also easier when you're in a circumstance where you can actually watch behavior and look at leaders who you respect and trust and see that happening to them and understand that they're human, but understand what individual small steps made them go down that slope. And my sense is that we're not building the kind of mechanisms and institutions to deal with that kind of behavior. Instead, we're basically silently affirming it, sort of where Sir Thomas More might have been back in the days of Henry VIII. Oh, my goodness.
I might ask you, since I spent my time not one too, do you see this decline in moral and ethical values being shared equally in the public service and the politicians, or unique to one or the other? Or what do you think?
So this is why I'm no longer in the public service. I have worked with what's called the Association of Professional Executives of Canada for the last 10 years. It's an association loosely called for people who are at senior levels because we're not unionized. And so it's an organization through whom we kind of allow voice to be given to executives about issues. 2 years ago, we were asked by the Public Service Commission to set up a office where people could privately come and talk about things that were happening in their work environment that were causing them concern that they couldn't legitimately raise through their, human resource systems and their, lines of authority. And the number of cases were astounding on unethical behavior in the public service. So while I think we hear a lot more and it's a lot easier to get media attention when it's, and I shouldn't name names, I guess, when the Gomery Commission report starts to document a lot of behavior around the sponsorship fund, we hear a lot less about it in terms of public servants, but there's a lot of that kind of activity I fundamentally believe and have witnessed going on in the public service itself. I do believe there is a culture of entitlement creeping into the public service, especially at more senior levels. And in really thinking about this and in doing some of the research we've done around why that might be a perception that might be a reality, a lot centers around the time when, yes, we broke this social contract, but when also we began to pay public servants a lot more. And actually, people began to want to get higher and higher in the public service because their income grew and their pensions grew and their benefits grew. It was no longer about doing good. It was no longer about fundamentally believing in something and building it. And it didn't matter what level you were or what job you had. You were just there to do it. Now, there are huge, extraordinary exceptions to that. And I actually have one that's in my family right now. But there is too much of that happening, and we're not speaking about it openly. There is no open, safe space to have this conversation in the public service currently.
I think that my question is actually two parts. One is I heard you speaking of the most recent 8th principle. In your journeys and studies, I'm sure you've gathered some specific, maybe effective principles that resonate for you, not necessarily written by somebody else, or certainly open to those that might have been said by others that mean more for you. So I would ask that. I would also say to you that if you live those principles and you live them constantly in the context of a place where it's not shared, it takes energy, and it takes a lot of energy. What would you suggest might be some safe havens for people to go to re-energize in order for them to always show up as leaders of integrity and leaders with ethics?
Thank you for those really easy questions. The one thing that I keep coming back to is you've got to be authentic. It's so easy to become something else than that what you are. We're all human beings. We all have frailties and we all have strengths. And respecting that and understanding each other that way, my sense is you have to remain authentic. And so one of my absolute principles as a leader, as a manager, as a colleague, is to be authentic in what I say and do. That I believe fundamentally what I say. I don't put on a different persona when I'm in the office or at home, that I am who I am, and I bring that very directly into my work environment and my decisions. I spoke about some of the values my parents gave me, a real sense of being committed to doing good, to public service, to making sure that, I built effective institutions, that I treated people with dignity and respect, that I was somebody who believed in diversity of opinions. And actually, it's one of the great contributions St. Jerome's gave me was that ability to experiment, to feel safe to experiment, to understand very competing points of views, feminism, the Catholic Church, and to work those through for me and be authentic about what they meant to me and never feel that I could still not hold certain views that could be maybe inconsistent with others. So it's that authenticism that to me really matters. And where are there safe spaces? This is a terrific one. I think families are a good one. My sense is that we need some commons. We do for more of the public discourse, immigration, for an example. We don't have a safe haven to talk about what's happening with immigration today, where we're talking about a lot of refugees coming in from countries that don't hold the Christian principles that we have, as our generation of baby boomers have grown up in, have been accustomed to. How do we deal with talking about that without feeling that we're racist? We need some commons. We need some of those spaces. It's up to us to create them. I think it's up to academic institutions to allow for some of that. I fundamentally believe, and it's one of my passions until I die, that we need some Smithsonian-type institutes in this country to bring thought leaders together and people who are just regular, ordinary citizens together into this kind of a discourse. There's lots of ways to engage people. We just need to actually take advantage and put them into practice. Let me come back to one other thing. In workplaces, you're absolutely right. And usually there are two decisions. You bury yourself, where those institutions or values are inconsistent or the behaviors are inconsistent with yours. And I've seen a lot of people do that in the public service. Or you leave. And it's not neither are palatable solutions. There have to be ways where, in fact, people are able to tackle some of those issues and know that they're not going to have harm done to them. I'm not sure we have that currently, that current capacity right now in the public service of the federal government, at least. I'm hoping that's not true for where you work or live or play. Boy, what a downer.
Well, thank you, Eva, for creating a safe space to talk about this tonight and for us to listen to your thoughts. It's been great. The expression of ideas passionately held and clearly and crisply expressed is always a source of happiness for me, and I know for everybody here. And so I thank you for, increasing the gross national Jimba in this room this evening. And thank you very much for all that you've done, all the careful thinking that you've done in making your presentation tonight. I appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody here does. Thank you.